The man who called himself Silas lived where the world had cracked open and died. His cabin was a scar on the lip of a high mesa, overlooking a valley of ghosts. Wind was the only preacher here, and its sermon was always the same, a long, mournful cry about things lost and never found. The juniper trees clung to the rock like arthritic fingers, their scent a sharp, clean memory of a greener world. It was in the season of the ghost moon, when the air grew teeth and the first snows came, to bleed the color from the land, that he found her. He wasn't looking. He was checking the few snares he still bothered to set, his breath pluming in the crystalline air, his steps crunching a delicate ruin into the frost-kissed ground. The trail led him to the edge of the creek, a vein of water so cold it was already growing a skin of ice along its edges. She was half in the water, half on the frozen mud of the bank, a tangle of black hair and sodden buckskin. At first, he thought she was a dead doe, cast down from the rocks above. But then a shudder racked her frame, a tremor so slight it was almost indistinguishable from the shivering of the creek itself. Silas froze. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and the quiet hum of danger that was the bedrock of this land, screamed at him to turn back. To unsee it, this was not his business. This was a death belonging to others, a grief he had no right to touch. He had come here to be forgotten, a man whittled down to nothing but regret and the horizon, and the dead had a way of reminding the world you still existed. He took a step closer. She was young. A girl, perhaps, though the harshness of this life aged faces into masks. Her skin was the color of rich earth, now pale with cold. A dark stain, almost black in the failing light, spread from her side, melting a small, obscene circle in the snow around her. It was blood, so much blood. And wrapped around her, soaked and useless, was the ghost of something he knew too well. The dark blue wool of a U.S. cavalry coat. The sight of it punched the air from his lungs. It was a brand, a curse. He knew that coat. He knew the brass buttons that winked like cruel, unblinking eyes. He had worn one once, a lifetime ago, when he still had a name given to him by his mother and a belief in the righteousness of flags. He knelt, the cold of the ground seeping through the worn leather of his trousers. Her face was turned away, pressed into the icy mud. He could leave her. The coyotes would come. The snow would deepen. By morning, she would be a memory of the land, another secret swallowed by the silence. It was the sensible thing, the safe thing. It was the thing a man who wanted to remain a ghost would do. But as he hesitated, a sound broke the stillness. High above, a red-tailed hawk sliced through the bruised twilight, its cry a single piercing note of judgment. It hung in the air, sharp and clean and absolute. And in that same moment, a whisper, fragile as a moth's wing, escaped the girl's lips. It was not his name. It was not a plea for help. It was a word in a tongue he did not know, a sound like falling leaves and river stones. Dazoni. The word hung in the air between them, a wisp of smoke from a fire he could not see. It wasn't meant for him. It was a name, a prayer, a farewell aimed at someone else, somewhere else. And in that moment, Silas knew he was lost. He could not unhear it. He could not leave a prayer to die unanswered in the mud. With a groan that was part exertion and part the sound of a tomb opening, he gathered her into his arms. She was lighter. Then she looked, a bird made of hollow bones and fading warmth. The cavalry coat, heavy with water and blood, gaped open. Beneath it, on the skin of her forearm, he saw the faint, raised lines of ritual scars, a pattern like lightning forking toward her wrist. He carried her away from the creek, away from the judgment of the hawk, his own blood thundering in his ears. He was no longer a ghost. He was a man carrying a dying girl, and he knew, with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the coming night, that he had just invited the whole world of the dead back into his life. The valley below, the one he never looked at, the one that held the ashes of his shame, seemed to watch him go. The wind rose, and it whispered a litany of names he had spent a decade trying to forget. And now he had been given one more. The cabin was a cell of lamplight and shadows, the two of them trapped inside it like ghosts in a bottle. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke, drying herbs, and the metallic tang of blood. Silas had stripped away the sodden buckskin and the hated blue coat, laying her on his own cot, a rough-hewn bed that had known only his solitary troubled sleep. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency. The wound was a deep, ragged tear along her ribs, crusted with dirt and frozen blood. A fall, he guessed. A slip from the high rocks, a cruel embrace with a shard of granite. He cleaned it as best he could with boiled water and a clean rag, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. Every touch was a transgression. He was a white man, his hands stained with a history he could not wash away, and he was touching the sacred wounded flesh of one of the people. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. He was no hero, he was the opposite. He was the reason men like him were hated and feared. He was Silas Thorne, a name he had buried long ago, a name that belonged to a scout who rode with the 3rd Cavalry. A man who had led Major Evans's command into a valley he was told held a renegade war party. He had followed the tracks, the signs, and pointed the way. But the intelligence was wrong. It wasn't a war party. It was a winter camp, women, children, old men, a place of sanctuary. He hadn't fired a shot. He had watched in horror from the ridge, the first rifle volleys echoing like the crack of doom. He had turned his horse and ridden away, the screams of the dying chasing him across the plains, a coward who had refused to participate in the slaughter, but whose hands were just as bloody for having led them to the door. He was cast out by the army for desertion, and cast out by his own conscience for being too late. He had come to this lonely mesa to serve his sentence in silence, and now this. The girl on his cot was a living embodiment of his sin. She was a specter from that valley, a piece of the past he had tried to outrun, now breathing shallowly under his roof. He looked at her face in the flickering lamplight. She was not a child. She was a young woman, her features etched with a quiet, fierce nobility that even unconsciousness could not erase. Her stillness was a condemnation. He stitched the wound closed with a needle and gut thread, his movements clumsy but determined. He remembered his wife Elora, doing the same for a farmhand who had tangled with a boar. Elora, with her gentle hands and her belief in a kindness he had long since abandoned. She and their boy Samuel, taken by the fever years before his flight to the frontier, their absence a hollow ache that never faded. He was a man defined by what he had lost and what he had thrown away. The girl did not stir. Her breathing was a fragile rhythm in the oppressive silence of the cabin. Her wounds were not just in her side. He saw them in the taut line of her jaw, the way her closed eyelids twitched. He saw them in the ritual scars on her arm, a story written in flesh he could not read. He took the cavalry coat and held it over the flames of his stone hearth. The wool sizzled, curled, and then caught, the dark blue fabric turning to orange, and then black. The brass buttons, polished by some long-dead soldier, fell into the embers like dropped coins. He was burying the evidence, but it wasn't for the girl's sake. It was for his, an offering to a past that would not stay dead. Days bled into one another. The world outside was a canvas of white snow and gray sky. The cabin became a timeless space, a fragile bubble of warmth against the vast indifferent cold. He fed her broth, spooning it gently past her cracked lips. He changed the poultice on her wound, a mixture of yarrow and mashed juniper berries, a remedy Elora had taught him. He spoke to her, not in sentences, but in low murmurs, the way a man might talk to a frightened horse. He didn't know if she could hear him. On the 3rd day, her eyes opened. They were the color of dark, wet earth, and they held no fear. No gratitude, nothing, They simply watched him, ancient and unreadable. She did not speak. He would offer her water, and she would drink. He would offer her broth, and she would eat. But she remained a vessel of silence, her presence a constant low-grade fever in his soul. Their silence was a living thing. It filled the spaces between the crackling of the fire and the howling of the wind. It was a clash of two profound solitudes, two worlds of pain occupying the same small room. He was haunted by the ghosts of the people he had failed to save. She, he suspected, was haunted by the ghosts of the people who had been taken from her. He would look at the fire and see the reflection of a burning camp. She would stare into the same flames, and he wondered what she saw. A lodge fire? A funeral pyre? The destruction of a world? Her gaze was unnerving. She would follow his movements, her eyes deep and still. Sometimes he felt like he was the one being nursed, his soul being laid bare and examined by her silent judgment. He was the rescuer, the caregiver, but he had never felt more like a prisoner. He was trapped not by her, but by what she represented. He was a man alone with his conscience, and his conscience had taken on the form of a wounded native woman on his cot. The storm passed. The world outside was reborn in a blinding, pristine white. The sun, when it finally broke through the clouds, was a pale, wintry disk that offered light but no warmth. Inside the cabin, a different kind of thaw was beginning. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the first drip of meltwater from an icicle. The girl, he still didn't know her name, only the prayer she'd whispered at the creek, was healing. The fever had broken, and a faint blush of life had returned to her cheeks. She could sit up on her own now, propped against the wall, a wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Her silence remained, a vast, unbroken territory between them, but her eyes had changed. The emptiness was being replaced by a watchful intelligence. She was no longer just a body in his bed. She was a presence, a mind. He went about his chores, his movements self-conscious under her steady gaze. He split wood, mended a worn saddle strap, cleaned his rifle, a weapon he now kept unloaded and propped in the far corner of the cabin. It felt like a profanity in her presence. One afternoon, as he was stirring a thin rabbit stew over the fire, she moved. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, her bare feet touching the cold floorboards. She winced, a hand going to her bandaged side, but her resolve was firm. She stood, unsteady but upright, the blanket wrapped around her like a shawl. Silas stopped stirring, the wooden spoon hovering over the pot. He didn't know what to do. Should he help her? Would she recoil from his touch? He remained still, watching her. She ignored him. Her focus was entirely on the hearth. With a slow, deliberate grace, she knelt before the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across her face, illuminating the strong lines of her cheekbones and the solemn set of her mouth. She reached out a slender hand, not to the warmth, but to the pile of gray ash and blackened charcoal at the edge of the fire pit. She took a small piece of charcoal between her thumb and forefinger. On the dusty, wide plank of the floor, she began to draw. Her movements were not random. They were precise, filled with an ancient purpose. First, a spiral, turning inward. Then, she drew a sharp, straight line that cut through the outer ring of the spiral, breaking it. A broken spiral. The symbol meant nothing to him, yet he felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. It felt like a word, a glyph from a language older than speech. She looked at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before her eyes lifted and met his. It was the first time she had truly looked at him, not just through him. There was a question in her gaze, a challenge. He had no answer to give. He could only shake his head, a gesture of his own profound ignorance. A flicker of something, disappointment, resignation, crossed her features. She turned back to the hearth. And then she began to hum. It was a low, guttural sound, more a vibration in the chest than a melody. It was the sound of the earth, of wind over rock, of deep, resonant grief. It wasn't for him. He knew that instantly. The song was aimed outward, through the chinked logs of the cabin, through the miles of snow and silence. It was a call, a signal, a prayer sent out into the vast emptiness, a quiet announcement that she was here, that she was alive. He realized with a dawning horror that she was not humming for someone who was lost. She was humming for someone who was listening, for someone who was watching. The fragile peace of their shared shelter shattered. The quiet was no longer a space of healing. It was the held breath before a thunderclap. The ominous feeling had since he found her coalesced into a sharp, cold certainty. He hadn't just saved a life. He had taken a hostage, or become one. The silence of the land was no longer empty. It was waiting. He found himself listening, too. Every creak of the cabin logs, every skittering of a mouse in the thatch, every sigh of the wind became a footstep, an approach. He would stand at his small, grimy window, peering out at the unforgiving landscape, the endless sea of white and the dark, skeletal shapes of the trees. He was watching for a sign, for the answer to the call she was sending out from his own hearth. The days that followed felt like a dream, a strange, sacred, and terrifying interlude. She spoke no words, but her presence filled the cabin. She would sometimes draw other symbols in the ashes star with 7 points, a line of stick figures walking towards a mountain, a serpent eating its own tail. He would watch, a helpless observer in a ritual he could not comprehend. He was tending to her body, but her spirit was somewhere else entirely, communing with forces he could not see. He was a man caught in the gears of a great and ancient machine he had accidentally set in motion. He had nursed her back from the brink of death, and in doing so, he had lit a beacon. And now something was coming for the light. It happened just before the dawn of the 5th day. The sky was not yet black, but a deep, bruised purple, the stars beginning to fade like dying embers. A stillness had fallen over the land, a silence, so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. Even the wind had died. Silas was awake. He hadn't truly slept in days. He was sitting in his chair by the cold hearth, the unloaded rifle across his lap, a useless talisman. The girl was asleep on the cot, her breathing finally deep and even. For a moment, in the pre-dawn quiet, he allowed himself to believe the humming had been a dream, the drawings a phantom of his own guilty mind. Then he saw it. Through the small window on the ridge opposite his cabin, a silhouette appeared against the lightning sky. A single rider on a horse. The shape was stark, motionless, a piece of the night that refused to yield to the day. It wasn't a traveler. It wasn't a lost hunter. It was a sentinel. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the immense quiet. He did not move. He did not breathe. He just watched. For a long time, there was only the one. A statue carved from shadow and patience. Then, as if summoned from the earth itself, another appeared beside the first, and another, and another. They materialized out of the fog that clung to the low places, silent as smoke, their forms indistinct and spectral in the gloaming. 10, 20, more. An entire line of them spread out along the ridge, their horses standing stock still, their heads lowered. They were a living wall, a silent judgment. The land, which had been his sanctuary of solitude, now felt impossibly small, crowded by their immense collective presence. Every tree, every rock, seemed to be an extension of them. He was not just in their territory. He was in their world, a world he had only ever trespassed upon. Then they began to move, not with a charge, not with a cry, but with a slow, deliberate purpose. They flowed down the slope from the ridge, their movements fluid and unnervingly quiet, the soft thud of unshod hooves on snow the only sound. They didn't ride towards his door. They fanned out, forming a wide, loose circle around the cabin. Their perimeter 100 yards out. They were a net, and he was the fish caught in the center. The sun broke over the horizon, its first rays spilling across the snow, setting the world ablaze with a cold white fire. The light caught the metal on a lance, the beadwork on a shirt, the obsidian darkness of their braided hair. They were no longer ghosts in the mist. They were flesh and blood. They were power, they were history, and they had come to his door. A figure detached from the circle and began to walk toward the cabin. He was on foot. An older man, his face a mask of deeply etched lines, each one a story of hardship and survival. He wore a simple buckskin shirt, unadorned except for a single eagle feather tied in his long graying hair. His every step was heavy with authority. He walked not like he was approaching a stranger's home, but like he was inspecting his own property. Beside him, his hand resting on the man's shoulder, walked a boy of about 14, his face a younger, smoother echo of the elders, his eyes holding a fierce, focused intensity. Silas knew this was the end of the waiting. This was the reckoning. He placed the rifle carefully on the floor. He stood up, his joints cracking in the cold air, and walked to the door. His hand trembled as he lifted the wooden latch. He pulled the door open and stepped outside into the blinding morning light, blinking against the glare. He did not look at the ring of silent riders. He looked only at the man approaching. The air was frigid, but he could feel a trickle of sweat run down his back. The world had gone utterly quiet. The chirping of a snowbird, the rustle of a branch, all of it was gone, swallowed by the sheer weight of their presence. The elder and the boy stopped 20 feet from him. The man's eyes, dark and piercing, scanned Silas from head to toe, missing nothing. They were eyes that had seen the birth and death of seasons, the promises of treaties, and the blood of their breaking. They were the eyes of a judge. For what felt like an eternity, no one spoke. The only sound was the frantic, useless beat of Silas's own heart. Finally, the elder's voice cut through the silence. It was not loud, but it carried, with the clarity of a striking bell. The words were English, spoken with a heavy, deliberate cadence. You touched one of ours. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a verdict. And in that moment, all the fight, all the fear, all the carefully constructed walls of Silas's solitude crumbled into dust. He was not standing before an enemy. He was standing before a truth he had been running from for 10 years. The weight of it, the sheer, crushing gravity of his past in this present moment, buckled his knees. He did not fall. He lowered himself, slowly, deliberately, onto one knee in the snow. He bowed his head, his gaze fixed on the frozen ground at his feet. It was not an act of fear. It was an act of surrender. An act of atonement. He had no defense. He had no rights here. He was a debtor before his creditor, and the debt was a decade old and payable in blood. The old man, the one they called Dasodahe, he just sits there, watched the white man kneel in the snow. He did not react. His face remained a canyon of ancient patience. He gestured with his chin, a silent command. 2 riders dismounted and walked to the cabin, their steps measured, their hands resting on the knives at their belts. They disappeared inside. Silas remained on his knee, his head bowed, the cold of the snow seeping into his bones. He was prepared for anything, a knife in the back, the butt of a rifle to his skull. He had rehearsed this moment in 1,000 nightmares. He had earned it. The silence stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. He heard movement inside the cabin, then a soft voice speaking in the end language of the Chiricahua. It was her voice, the first he had ever truly heard. It was low and clear, not the voice of a victim, but of someone giving a report. Another voice, one of the men's, answered in a respectful murmur. The 2 warriors emerged from the cabin, and between them, she walked. The girl, the woman. She was wrapped in the blanket from his cot, her bare feet pale against the white snow. She moved with a stiff grace, favoring her wounded side, but her head was held high. Her eyes, those dark pools of earth, found his, but he could not read the expression in them. She walked to the old chief and stood beside him, her small frame dwarfed by his presence. She spoke to him in their tongue, her words a soft flowing river. Dusk listened, his gaze never leaving Silas. The boy, Kenai, watched the woman with a mixture of reverence and concern. When she finished speaking, a new silence fell, heavier than before. This was the moment of judgment. Dusk took a step forward, his shadow falling over Silas. "She is Iska," the chief said, his English slow, as if tasting each foreign word. "Daughter of my sister. Her mother was killed in the valley of the Weeping Willows 10 winters past." The words struck Silas like stones. The Valley of the Weeping Willows. That was what the scouts had called it. The place he had led Major Evans, the place of his shame. His breath hitched. He looked up, his eyes meeting the chief's. "I was there," Silas whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "I was the scout. I led them." He expected rage, a cry of vengeance from the warriors encircling them. He expected the boy Kenai to lunge at him, but there was nothing. Only the immense, bottomless quiet of the old man's gaze. "We know," Dusk said, the words impossibly calm. "The spirits have long memories. We have been watching this place, watching the ghost who punishes himself on this rock. We did not know why. Now we do." He gestured to Iska. She was not wounded by a white man. She fell from the cliffs while tracking a mountain cat. For 2 days she lay near the frozen creek. She was dying. He paused, letting the weight of his next words settle. "She told us she was not alone. She said a spirit was with her, a man with eyes the color of a winter sky, a man whose own spirit was broken. She said this man carried her." Silas stared, his mind reeling. She had seen him before he found her. "Iska is a dreamer," the chief continued, his voice taking on a reverent tone. "She walks in 2 worlds. Months ago, she had a vision. She saw the man who brought the long knives to her mother's lodge. She saw him living alone, wrapped in a blanket of sorrow. Her vision told her that his guilt was a stone tied to the ankle of our people's memory. It could not be forgotten until it was faced." The chief looked from Silas to Iska, and then back again. "Her spirit sought you out. Her body followed. She did not know if you would kill her or save her. She only knew she had to find the man from her vision. She had to stand before the ghost of the Weeping Willows." The pieces fell into place, forming a picture so strange and profound it defied all reason. This wasn't an accident. It was an appointment. A meeting orchestrated by forces he couldn't begin to understand. She hadn't just stumbled upon him. She had been guided to him, a living arrow fired from the past. He hadn't rescued her. He had been summoned. The first shocking twist, that he had led the raid that killed her mother, was met not with vengeance, but with the second, more staggering truth. She had known. Her spirit had known. And she had come anyway. "You did not run," Dusk said, his voice softer now, a sound of curiosity. "You did not leave her to the coyotes. You burned the soldier coat. You tended her wound. You gave her your shelter." He tilted his head. "Why?" Silas looked at Iska, at her proud, silent face. He looked at the circle of warriors there, faces hard and unreadable. He looked at the vast, uncaring land that had been his witness. There was no lie that would serve him here, only the truth, as ugly and bare as it was. "Because I am a coward," Silas said, the words tearing from his throat. "I ran then, from the killing. I was afraid to die, but more afraid to live with what I had done. I have spent 10 years here, trying to die a slower death. When I found her, leaving her would have been the same as running. Again, I am tired of running." He looked down at his hands, calloused and empty. I deserve whatever you give me. I earned it that day, in the valley. He bowed his head again, fully expecting the end. He had confessed. He had delivered himself into their hands. The circle was complete. The boy Kenai stepped forward, his eyes burning with a fire that was missing from his father's. He spoke rapidly in their language to Desodahe, his hand gesturing toward Silas, his voice tight with an anger that was sharp and young. He was speaking of vengeance, of justice, of blood for blood. Desodahe listened patiently. When the boy was finished, he placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a silent message to be still. He looked at Silas, still kneeling in the snow. My son says you should die the way his grandmother died, the chief said, his voice flat. He has a right to that anger. It is a clean anger. But vengeance is a fire that warms you for a night and leaves you cold in the ashes. We have had enough of ashes. He turned to Iska. He spoke to her softly. She listened, and then gave a single sharp nod. She stepped forward, the blanket pooling around her feet. She stood directly in front of Silas, so close he could feel. The faint warmth radiating from her. He braced himself. This was it. Her right. The right of the wronged. But she did not strike him. She did not spit on him. Instead, she slowly, deliberately reached out her hand, and she placed it on his bowed head. The touch was light, almost weightless, but it landed on him with the force of a mountain. A current, electric and alive, passed through him. It was not a gesture of forgiveness. It was not an act of affection. It was something far older, far more profound. It was a claiming, an acknowledgement, a seal being pressed into the wax of his soul. The world held its breath. The ring of warriors, the stern chief, the angry boy, they all watched, silent and unmoving. In that moment, under the weight of her hand, Silas Thorne, the cavalry scout, the ghost of the mesa, ceased to exist. He was being unmade and remade. Right there in the snow, under the cold winter sun. They did not take him. They did not kill him. They built a fire. It was a great, roaring pyre in the center of the circle they had formed around his cabin. They fed it with the dead, dry limbs of juniper and pine, and the flames leaped toward the sky, a column of crackling orange life against the stark white of the snow. The heat was immense, pushing back the frigid air. The sun was climbing higher, but its light seemed pale and thin compared to the raw power of the fire. The drums started. A single deep heartbeat, slow and deliberate. Then another joined it, and another, until the air vibrated with a rhythm that was the pulse of the earth itself. It was a solemn, powerful sound, a sound that spoke of time and blood and memory. Silas was brought before the fire. 2 warriors stood behind him, their presence a silent, unmovable wall. He thought he understood. This was a trial, a purification. Perhaps they would make him walk through the embers to burn the guilt from his flesh. He was ready. He had accepted his fate. But it was not a trial. Iska walked toward the fire, her silhouette dark against the dancing flames. She was no longer wearing his blanket. She was dressed in a fine doeskin dress, adorned with intricate quillwork and beads that caught the firelight like tiny, trapped stars. Her hair was combed smooth, a river of black silk falling down her back. She looked like a priestess, a princess, a spirit made flesh. She walked to her uncle, Desodahe, who stood beside the fire, his face illuminated by the light, looking more like a carved monument than a man. They spoke for a moment in low tones, their words swallowed by the roar of the flames and the thunder of the drums. Silas watched, a helpless observer in a ceremony that was unfolding around him, for him, but utterly beyond his comprehension. He believed it was a funeral rite, perhaps for her mother, a final reckoning with the ghosts of the Valley of Weeping Willows. He felt a profound, sorrowful respect. He tried to recede, to become small, to show that he understood this sacred. Moment was not his, but Desodahe's eyes found him. The chief gestured for him to be brought forward. The two warriors nudged him, and he walked on unsteady legs until he was standing on the opposite side of the fire from the chief and Iska. The heat was scorching on his face. The smoke stung his eyes. The drumming stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the hungry crackle of the fire. Desodahe's voice rose, clear and strong, speaking not to Silas, but to his people, who stood in a wide circle around them. He spoke in the end tongue, his words rising and falling in a powerful cadence. His hands moved as he spoke, painting pictures in the air. He pointed to Iska. He pointed to the sky. He pointed to the valley to the south. And then he pointed at Silas. A murmur went through the assembled people, a ripple of sound, of surprise, of assent. The chief fell silent. He looked across the fire at Silas, his dark eyes seeming to hold the flames within them. "You came to this place to erase your name," he said, his English returning, slow and measured. "You have succeeded. Silas Thorne is dead. We have burned him in this fire." He paused. "A man cannot live without a name. It is his anchor to the world. It tells the spirits who he is. Today we give you a new one." This wasn't a funeral. It wasn't a punishment. It was a naming. A christening by fire and drum and smoke. Silas was stunned into immobility. This was a gift he had not asked for, a grace he had not earned. It was so far beyond the realm of what he had expected, a swift death, a merciful torture, that his mind could not grasp it. "You are a man who carries a past that is not his alone. You carry our sorrow. You carry our memory of the fire and the blood," Desodahe said. "You tried to bury it, but it followed you. It found you through this woman. You did not turn away from it. You knelt before it. You gave it your shelter. You gave it your fire." Iska stepped forward, to the very edge of the roaring pyre. She held something in her hands, a small clay bowl. She dipped her fingers into it, and he saw they were stained with red ochre, a paste the color of drying blood. "We cannot give you forgiveness," the chief said, his voice dropping low. "That is for the Creator. We cannot give you peace. That is for you to find. But we can give you a purpose. We can give you a place. Not as one of us, but not as one of them." Iska walked around the fire. The heat was a living wall between them, but she moved through its shimmering aura without flinching. She stopped in front of Silas. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something other than silent judgment. He saw a shared history, a shared wound. She raised her hand, her fingers wet with the red clay. She pressed her thumb to his forehead, drawing a single vertical line from his hairline to the bridge of his nose. The clay was cool on his skin. Then she drew a horizontal line across his cheekbones from one temple to the other. He was being marked, claimed, branded not with fire, but with earth. "Your name," Desodahe declared, his voice ringing out into the silent assembly, "is Indagokaya, he who carries the apology." The name settled over him, a cloak of immense weight and profound, terrible honor. It was not a title, it was a burden, a life sentence. He was to be a living monument to a crime, and to a single fragile act of grace. The chief's eyes met his across the flames. "This woman's vision is not finished. She saw you save her, but she saw you standing between our people and a new shadow that is coming. A shadow of men with yellow stripes on their legs, looking for gold in our sacred mountains." He was not being given her hand in marriage, a gesture that would have been a crude and simple way to bind him. He was being given something infinitely more complex. He was being given her future. Their future. He was being named her guardian, not because he was strong or worthy, but because he was broken, because he understood the debt. He was being bound to them, not by a promise of love, but by the chain of his own guilt, now reforged into a shield. It was a sacred act, an irreversible covenant, so far beyond white comprehension that it felt like a myth being born in the firelight. He had come to this place seeking oblivion, and they had given him an identity. He had begged for punishment, and they had given him a purpose. He had expected to die, and instead, they had bound him to life. Their life, he did not leave. He did not stay, he remained. His cabin on the mesa was no longer a place of exile, but an outpost, a watchtower. He was a man caught between worlds, belonging to neither, but beholden to one. The people, the Chiricahua, receded back into the canyons, and the high places, melting into the landscape as quietly as they had appeared. But they were not gone. He felt their presence always, a silent awareness on the edge of his senses. Sometimes he would see the distant flicker of a signal fire on a faraway peak. Sometimes in the dust near his spring, he would find a single perfect feather, an eagle's, a hawk's left for him. A sign, a reminder. He was Indagolkaya. The name was his skin. When he looked in the small cracked piece of mirror he owned, he no longer saw Silas Thorne, the haunted ghost. He saw the faint stain of the red ochre, which had faded from his skin but not from the soul. He saw a man with a duty. Iska he did not see again for a long time. She had gone back to her people, to her own life. But she was the anchor of his new existence. His act of saving her had become the single pivot point of his life, turning him from a man running from his past to a man standing to face a future. He kept his rifle clean, but he did not hunt with it any more than was needed for his own sparse survival. Its purpose had changed. It was no longer a tool of a frontiersman. It was the weapon of a guardian. Months turned into a season. The snows melted, and the land came alive with the fierce brief bloom of the desert spring. One evening at dusk, he saw a movement at the edge of the tree line. It was the boy Kenai. He was a young man now, his face leaner, harder. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows. He did not approach the cabin, but stood watching him. The anger was still in his eyes, but it was tempered now with something else, a grudging understanding. Silas gave a slow, deliberate nod. Kenai held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded back, a curt, sharp gesture of acknowledgement. A truce. The boy turned and vanished back into the trees. The next generation was watching. The debt was eternal. The new shadow DeSoto Hay had spoken of did come. Prospectors, arrogant and loud, with yellow-striped trousers and a lust for the gold they believed was hidden in the Penaligo Mountains, the sacred ground of the people. They saw Silas's cabin as a foothold, a place to get information, supplies. They saw him as one of them, a fellow pioneer. They were wrong. You seeing any Injuns? A burly, bearded man asked him, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Silas's boot. We heard this area's thick with them. Got a government bounty on Apache scalps. Silas looked at the man, at his greedy eyes and cruel mouth, and he felt no kinship. He felt only a vast cold distance. He thought of Iska's hand on his head. He thought of the fire. This is not your land, Silas said, his voice quiet, flat. There is nothing for you here. You should leave. The man laughed. Who the hell are you to tell us where we can and can't go? This is free country. It has never been free, Silas replied. It has always had a price. They did not listen. They pushed on, into the canyons. They did not come back. Silas never knew what happened to them. He only knew that a few days later, he found a freshly butchered deer left on his doorstep. An offering, a payment. He lived out his years on that mesa. He became a feature of the land, as much a part of it as the juniper trees and the lichen-covered rocks. The lines on his face deepened. His hair turned the color of snow. He was the silent guardian, the man who carried the apology. The bridge between two worlds, built on a foundation of shame and cemented with a single act of grace. He died not in a battle, not defending the tribe from an attack, but as he had lived for so long, alone. An old man in his chair, looking out over the valley as the sun set, the sky lit with the colors of a dying fire. Years later, when the world had changed and the old ways were fading into memory, a young man from the reservation, the great-grandson of Kenai, brought his own son to the crumbling ruin of a cabin on a high windswept mesa. He showed him the stones of the hearth, the view of the valley. He told him the story of the dreamer, Iska, and the strange, sad white man who had saved her. The story had become a legend, whispered around lodge fires, a small but essential part of their history. The boy asked what had become of the man, and his father pointed to a smooth, flat stone near the cabin's foundation. Scratched into its surface, weathered by decades of wind and rain, were a few simple words in English, barely legible now. A final testament left by someone, perhaps by Kenai, perhaps by Desodahe himself long ago. A summary of a life that had been anything but simple. An epitaph for a man who had been given a new name and a new soul. The inscription read, "He gave what the others never did, time and blood and silence."